All right, so this presentation is going to not try to cover all of the various wanderings and adventures of Odysseus that take place in books 9 through 12, but rather to zero in on some specifics for some of them, but also to look at some artistic representations from both antiquity and from later eras, as to kind of expand our understanding of how these stories were understood and interpreted across the ages. So books 9 through 12 of the Odyssey are arguably the most famous and best known adventures from the entire epic, because they involve the kind of the most cinematic of them. This is Odysseus' encounters with various monsters and creatures, and it's this part of the story where he's in this magical realm that is quite different from the time that when we see him back on Ithaca, or the time that we see Telemachus and Athena on Ithaca. It's kind of a little mini movie of its all its own, and so it's the best remembered, and so it's worth zeroing in on and talking specifically about. So on the screen here, I have the kind of the list of the order in which these various adventures take place. Now you remember that we don't get these adventures in real time. They are told within the story as a flashback by Odysseus. So when Odysseus tells the story, he's with the Phaeacians. He's washed up on the shore. Remember when we first see Odysseus, he's on the island with Calypso, and he's been there for 7 years. And he's been there without his men, without his ships for 7 years. And all of his men are dead, drowned, killed, eaten, dismembered, you name it, in all of these various adventures. But when we hear these stories as an audience, we hear them just from the mouth of Odysseus, and that's caused some interesting speculation. That again, I don't know how much to push it, but this idea that can we trust Odysseus when he tells us these stories? We realize that none of his men are there to back him up or to say, hey, that didn't happen, or that didn't happen like that. We know that Odysseus, as a trickster character, as this Metis type hero, part of being a trickster character is being your ability to lie. So is he? One thing that you might ask yourself as you consider these adventures is, can we trust Odysseus to tell the truth about these things? Is he making himself look better, perhaps, than he actually was, or is it a fairly kind of straightforward, honest account, kind of a warts and all, the bad with the good kind of thing going on? Again, like I said, I don't know how much to push that argument, but I think it's definitely worth considering. With Homer, what I always say to my classes is you give Homer the benefit of the doubt. He doesn't put things into his epic just for the sake of throwing them in. He's the more I read and think about Homer, the more I'm astounded by how precise and careful a poet he is. And so this might be a layer kind of worth considering. It's just, it's one of dozens of things that just make this such a fascinating story. So, all of these stories in some ways explain what happened to all of his men, and how Odysseus kind of rises above them, or at least is given extra divine help. The Lotus Eaters, where the men just want to eat the lotus. It's kind of a drug addiction kind of scene. He has to drag them away. The Cyclops episode, which in the Big Idea forum this week I'm asking you to consider, arguably the most famous of the adventures. It's one of these stories that even if you haven't read the Odyssey, there's a good chance you've probably heard of the Cyclops episode. Aeolus, he's the king of the winds, the god of the winds, I should say, who gives Odysseus the bag, and these men open up the bag. You note there too, it's such an interesting pairing of Odysseus and his men. At some level, it's very clear that he doesn't trust them, and they don't trust him. You remember that he comes back to the ship with the bag, and he doesn't tell his men what's in it, but he proceeds to take a nap. And his men immediately suspect that he's hiding something from them. He said, what kind of that question they always come back to? What kind of man is Odysseus? What kind of leader is he? What kind of king is he? Is he heroic in a positive sense? Is he beyond critique, or is he just extremely deeply flawed? Like most human beings. The Lystragonians are a kind of doublet of the Cyclops scene, and kind of cannibalistic, wild subhumans. Circe, she's the queen, the goddess on her own island, and she turns strangers who wash up onto her shore into animals. At the very center of the adventures, which I'll talk more about in another lecture this week, the land of the dead. Odysseus goes technically not into the underworld, not down into the land of Hades, but he comes to its edge and gets a glimpse into the next world. And there he consults with Tiresias, and he sees all of these ghosts from people from his past, including the ghost of his mother, the ghost of Achilles, the ghost of Agamemnon. It's Circe who tells him that's what he needs to do if he wants to find out how to get home. Then the Sirens, whose deadly call lures sailors to their death and to their shipwreck. Odysseus ingeniously finds a way to be arguably the first one to sail past the Sirens, hear their song, and live to tell the tale. Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla is the six-headed monster on one side, and on the other side, Charybdis is kind of this swallowing, gulping vortex whirlpool that his men have to sail between. Again, and all along the way, ships are being sunk, men are being eaten and killed, and so numbers are dwindling. And the last straw is when they wind up on the island of Helios. Helios is simply the Greek word for sun. So Helios is the sun god, and they are on the island and given the stricture that you do not touch the cattle of Helios. That's a bridge too far for this particular god, but his men get fed up, and they decide to do it anyway, and they slaughter and kill some cattle, and that is the final nail in their coffin. From there, Odysseus winds up alone on the island with Calypso, and he lives there as her lover, as her concubine for 7 years. And note that too. I mean, definitely, it's always wrong, or at least imprecise, to take modern values and impose them upon this nearly 3,000-year-old story. We can't expect these characters to abide by modern liberal democratic ideas or Judeo-Christian morality. That would be an unfair imposition. But at the same time, think about that. Odysseus, on the one hand, we see him crying and he just wants to get back home to his son and to his beloved wife Penelope, but yet he spends a year with Circe, not just on her island, but as her lover, and with Calypso on her island for 7 years, again, not just as a hostage, but as her lover as well. How much does this man really want to get home, and how much does he just want to kind of always want to know what's around the next corner? Again, maybe that's just part of the paradox of the trickster character, part of the two-sidedness of Odysseus. It's also worth asking yourself, how many of his men, how many deaths of his own men could you lay at the feet of Odysseus himself? It's a difficult and in many ways kind of tragic question to ask and apply to this story. And then, as we saw earlier in the text, it's Calypso. Hermes comes down, tells her, "You gotta let him go." Zeus says, "You gotta let him go." And so she does so grudgingly, and he builds the raft, and he winds up amongst the Phaeacians, where he's taken in as a guest, and it's there that he tells this all of these adventures here as a flashback. All right, an interesting thing that happens, this didn't really happen with the Greeks themselves, but over time, as the Homeric stories became embedded in Greek culture, and then ultimately passed on to the Romans, over here in the boot of Italy. The Romans, by and large, were deeply enamored deeply indebted to ancient Greek culture, and so they were devotees and lovers of Homeric poetry, just as the Greeks were. And what developed over time was that particular places on the geography of the Mediterranean came to be associated with various of these adventures in books 9 through 12. Now, my sense is, and I could be wrong about this, but my sense is that when Homer has Odysseus kind of sail into these waters where you find the Cyclops and the Sirens and Circe and the island of Helios and Calypso and the Lotus Eaters, that what Homer really wants his audience to kind of imagine is that you've kind of stepped off into a never land. It kind of is like through the fog, you're going to go through the looking glass, and all of those adventures take place in kind of a magical realm that ultimately that Odysseus has to emerge from to return to the quote-unquote real world back on Ithaca, his home island. And one of the reasons I think that, and other scholars think that, is that when Odysseus leaves Troy, the last kind of known geographical landmark or point that Homer mentions is the name of this cape right here. And once Odysseus rounds his bend, again, the plan would have been to go around the bend and go back up to Ithaca. But he doesn't, and this is where he gets blown off course. And it's during these adventures we never hear of any other kind of geographical landmark at all. Now, that could very well be that Homer himself and the Greeks of that day didn't have much of an idea of what was over here. And so by default, you present the story as kind of a kind of off the cliff kind of legend. But once the Romans get their hands on it, it expands, and I think this is just a really kind of interesting kind of human development and an illustration of how these stories took on lives of their own. And so various places in and around Italy and around the north coast of Africa here, Sicily, Corsica and Sardinia here, became associated with various legends. And we know that Romans, wealthy Romans who had the time and the money to travel, would often go to these various places in a way that someone might visit a place where their favorite movie was filmed. It had a kind of cachet. It had a kind of inherent attraction that had developed, well beyond perhaps what Homer ever intended it to be. And there's some kind of interesting kind of historical kind of correlations as well. I'll just mention one here. This island down here, which is called Djerba, it's part of Tunisia today. This is the modern country of Tunisia, North Africa. But this island was known throughout antiquity for the growth of poppy plants, the same plant and flower that's used in the production of heroin. And so the addictive and hallucinogenic properties of the poppy have been long known. And so to associate that island with that historical connection with the lotus eaters, this plant that you just want to eat and keep on eating, is a really kind of nice, in some ways, very consistent fit between the historical reality and the story itself. So it's not all just kind of arbitrary things. I could go on and on here with other kind of connections, but I mean, some of those will come up in the following slides. But like I said, this is not something that the Greeks themselves really did or encouraged, but really kind of took on a life of its own as the Mediterranean world passed into the hands of the Romans. Now, I want to look at a few kind of illustrations from ancient Greek art and some other illustrations as well, just to kind of give you a different take on the. We're reading it as a silent narrative. We know that it was a sung narrative for the Greeks, but their art also celebrated their mythology as well, and Homeric scenes show up again and again and again in ancient Greek art. This is what we call a black figure vase painting for obvious reasons. And when you see black figure vase paintings, it's usually from the, generally speaking, the earlier part of Greek vase making and art. You can see that the figures are still a little bit crude and not all that lifelike. But here we clearly have the Cyclops scene. And if the number of illustrations is any indication of popularity of particular scenes, it would seem that the Cyclops scene, even for the ancient Greeks, was their favorite. And I think that probably carries on to this very day. Like I said, it's probably still the best known scene from the epic, whether you've read it or not. So here we see Odysseus and his men, I don't know who's who here, but jabbing the stake into his eye, offering him the wine cup. You remember that's what gets him drunk and asleep. And you notice here too, this just strikes me as kind of probably unintentionally comical. The Cyclops is carrying two severed legs of Odysseus' men. You remember that he dashes a number of them against the rock and devours them. Here's another one, black figure vase. This is likely Odysseus in the front, again jamming the stake into the Cyclops' eye. He's got just kind of his weird leg up here. I mean, we'll look at lots of Greek art too, and it's hard, especially if you're new to this. It's hard not to focus in on the nudity. Masculine nudity in Greek art is very common, and it was very rarely meant to be erotic or sexual in any kind of way. Masculine nudity, as we talked briefly about, like the Olympic Games, was meant to be connected to the divine, and so the nudity of these kinds of characters shouldn't surprise us. Here's a later, what we call a red figure vase painting, even though the figures you see here are kind of more orangish or yellow. Here it's a little bit more kind of, you can see the vase itself. This is what we call a crater, a big mixing bowl for wine. And the rendering of the figures is a little bit more lifelike. They've stepped up their game. But here here's the kind of the Cyclops, here he's asleep and drunk. with a wine cup next to him. This is very likely Odysseus with his staff kind of and his cloak, bossing his other men around here. Here they seem to be wrestling with a tree. I don't know why there's a tree growing in the middle of the Cyclops cave, but that's one of the things I find so interesting about visual representations. They'll often it's clear that they are telling the story from the epic, but they will often shift it. Cinematic visual narratives can do things that written, spoken, or sung narratives simply can't. Here's a very early black figure vase painting. You can see that the figures are very, very crude, but again, it's the same thing. Jamming the stake into the Cyclops' eye. Here he's sitting up, not on the ground, and he still has the wherewithal to kind of hang on to his wine cup. He's still taking care of his beverage. You gotta respect that to some degree. Just one more here, I think, from the Cyclops scene. Again, these are just a handful of dozens of versions of the Cyclops that you find in ancient Greek art. And here you remember how the way that Odysseus and his men escape from the cave by lashing themselves to the Cyclops' giant sheep. And so when the Cyclops reaches down blindly, he doesn't feel the men; he just feels the tops of his sheep, and they can escape from the cave by the skin of their teeth. Just some other ones that I've just chosen just for the sake of illustration. What you're looking at here is a fresco from not a Greek art, but from Roman art. This is from the walls of one of the villas of some wealthy Roman from Pompeii. As I'm sure some of you have heard, Pompeii is one of a handful of towns in southern Italy that was buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in August of the year 79. And it was an absolute day of hell for the people who lived there. Thousands of people died, but an absolute gift for an absolute archaeological treasure for modern day. And so Pompeii, which has almost been fully excavated, there are parts of it that still lie buried, is this absolute gift to the modern world for understanding how the ancient Romans lived. And what we found in many of these wealthy villas is that the Romans still preferred Homeric scenes on their walls. I mean, not entirely across the board, but they show up again and again, just like the Greeks. And so wealthy Romans would have scenes from the Odyssey, scenes from the Iliad, decorating their magnificent, sprawling country houses. So here we have the Lystrigonians chucking rocks at Odysseus' escaping ships, just like the Cyclops does in the Cyclops episode. Circe. I mentioned Circe here. I have this Greek title here, Potniatheron. So Circe falls into kind of a literary type that even the Greeks recognize. Potniatheron means like mistress of animals or mistress of beasts, and it's kind of a stock. I mean, you still see this kind of character in fantasy narratives. You might call her kind of a witch in the woods. That is, if you go deep enough into the woods, away from civilization, you might find kind of dark powers that you mess with at your own peril. And so Circe is in the Western tradition amongst the first of these, and so she is the one who, using her magic, changes Odysseus' men into potions. I show this painting over here not because I think it's a good painting. This is a much later post-Greek, post-ancient painting. Actually, I think it's a fairly tacky painting myself. But it illustrates the point. Here we have Circe, who's kind of she's bare-chested, clothed from the waist down. She's presented as a kind of earth goddess who just the way that she appears kicks against the expectations of civilization for women. She's something else. She's something other. And in her mansion there, she's surrounded by all these various animals, some of them alive, some of them skinned, that we imagine were unlucky sailors who stumbled upon her her home. Here's a red figure vase painting, again the Circe episode. Here we see Odysseus' men in these awkward positions of, in the process of turning into pigs. Remember, of course, with the help of Hermes and the magic moly plant, he is resistant to Circe's charms. And just like the painting here shows here, although the narrative's a little bit out of whack, Odysseus, remember, threatens Circe with his sword, threatens to kill her before they come together and become lovers for that year. Now the Sirens, this is a really interesting one. The Sirens is another one of these stories that has survived the centuries. But one interesting thing is that once it kind of gets out of the hands, out of the era of antiquity, it's been painted and interpreted and reinterpreted, told and retold, and almost invariably, if you see a kind of more modern, and by modern I mean in the last 500 years, telling of the siren story, it's almost always sexualized in a way. Like in this painting here, I believe this painting comes from the 19th century, the 1800s. I could be wrong specifically about that, but that's in the ballpark. And so here we have again, it's clearly that scene. We have Odysseus, tied to the mast. Remember, his men put wax in their ears so they can't hear the deadly song. But here, our artist has the sirens as mermaids, or kind of mermaids becoming human women, clambering aboard the ship very aggressively. Now, if you remember the scene in Homer's epic, one, it's very, very short, and two, Homer never describes the sirens at all. We hear them from a distance, but we never see them. He never describes them. So this is, again, taking that story and turning it into something else. And there's kind of this general notion out there that, how do the sirens, what's their lure? What is it that they use to lure you towards the rocks? Well, in modern tellings, it's their sexuality. They lure the men by their libido to their peril. Where if you look at an ancient version, it's radically different. Here again, it's Odysseus. This again, red figure face painting, probably 5th century BCE. Lashed to the mast, his men rowing away, and here the sirens are cast as these bird women, and this is not a scene that is sexualized at all. At least I hope you don't find it sexualized. And they're not just singing, but they're aggressively kind of dive bombing the ship. So on the one hand, it's of course it's the scene from the Odyssey, but even in this ancient version, they are changing the story. Whereas in the epic, they are unseen. And here the artist has kind of merged them with, maybe you've heard of them, the Harpies, these half bird, half women creatures that are aggressive and inimical to humanity. So this artist is doing a similar kind of thing, is expanding upon the narrative, doing something in a visual way, but this is far from the sexualization, the eroticization that we see in later versions. So I showed you that map that associated with particular places in the Mediterranean with these adventures. Again, this is not something that the Greeks themselves did, but the Romans associated this strait called the Strait of Messina, between which this narrow channel between the tip of the boot of Italy and the island of Sicily, kind of the football that the boot is kicking. And this strait was known as I think even today, as a difficult place to sail. Unpredictable currents, eddies, and rocks just beneath the surface. And so, but of course, if you were sailing, say if you were on a commercial ship and you wanted to get something from Rome, and you were going to sail something maybe off to Greece or the other side of Italy, you could save yourself a lot of time and money by taking the shortcut. It's kind of like a little mini Panama Canal, rather than going all the way around Sicily, where you would open yourself up to it takes longer, it's more expensive, you open yourself up to pirate attacks, but you cut through here and you can save all that. But the downside is this was a very difficult strait to sail, and so this is the strait that became associated with the Scylla and Charybdis story. And so this idea that the cliffs on one side is where the 6 heads of Scylla would leap out from, but the unpredictable currents would create these whirlpools in the strait. Yeah, again, it was one of these kind of very natural combinations between kind of the experience of the Roman sailors, what they went through, and how many shipwrecks happened through here, and the elements of that particular story, and this idea that the Scylla and Charybdis is kind of this needle that you have to thread. You have to kind of slip past carefully just between the monster on the one side and the threat of the whirlpool on the other side. So it was a very delicate maneuver to go through this strait, just as it was in the story. To the degree that the phrase "caught between a Scylla and Charybdis" survived as kind of a maxim. It's the origin of our phrase "caught between a rock and a hard place." It's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of phrase. And so it even pops up in again, I'm dating myself here, but there was a popular pop song back in the 80s by the band The Police, called "Wrapped Around Your Finger," where Sting, the songwriter, actually alludes to that. There's a line in that song that says, "You consider me the young apprentice, comma, caught between a Scylla and Charybdis." So I show you, this is actually an old political cartoon from the 18th century, from Britain, that makes use of the maxim here. So here it's a metaphorical portrayal. So it's Britannia between Scylla and Charybdis, and so here Scylla, the monsters disappeared, but we're left with the rock in a hard place. And it says, "Britannia between Scylla and Charybdis, the vessel of the Constitution steered clear of the rock of democracy and the whirlpool of arbitrary power." And so that's an allusion that's itself 2,500 years past Homer. That again is an illustration of how embedded Homer and his stories and his imagery are and continue to be in Western culture, and also how it takes on a life of its own and continues to grow and become other things. All right, that's enough for me for this one. See you next time.